I'm going to jump right in. So as physicians, we were trained to think and act in certain ways. And if you think back to your training as residents and medical students, think back to your rounds and think about the way that we were trained. We were trained not to take care of ourselves. We were trained to assume we don't have any human needs. We were trained to compare ourselves to everyone else, notice everything that we don't know. We were trained to catastrophize and I'm a primary care pediatrician, so I take perfectly healthy children and find things wrong with them. And so we do that in the rest of our lives as well. And so if you start to think about the way that we were trained, these things are really helpful to perhaps get you into medical school. Many of us also have these tendencies. That's kind of why we went into medicine. We're fixers, managers, and controllers. We think that's our job. So they help us short term. They helped us get into medical school. They helped us finish residency. They are not good long-term strategies for joy and wholeness. They're not good long-term strategies for a sustainable career in medicine. And so identifying what these things are, actually just noticing them is the key. A lot of people think that, and I do a lot of physician coaching, so changing is great, but 80 to 90% of the improvement in how you feel and the sustainability of a practice is in noticing your patterns. And that's where I would say what you practice grows and what you don't practice recedes. And so if you notice them, then you're separating yourself from them. They're not in charge, and then they begin to recede and your life begins to change, even without having to forcibly do a lot of this other work. And so this idea of doing no harm and stepping out of these patterns. So these are the ones that I thought I would bring up today. I'm giving another roundtable talk tomorrow, and I'm gonna throw some more of these into that. But these are the ones that for women physicians are particularly a problem. And so if you think back, we were trained in very much a shame culture. Think about rounds. They ask you questions as long as they can until you don't know the answer. And I will tell you that most of us are shame, blame, or guilt people. I'm a shame person. That's the thing. Like, I just have to avoid shame no matter what. Some of you will be guilt people. Like, you're driven by guilt and you make all your decisions that way. But if you think back to our training, shame, blame, and guilt are used in medical training the whole way through. And actually, honestly, we continue to do that to our colleagues. And so I would advocate that once we see this and how it's impacting us, we can be the change for everyone else around us. Catastrophizing causes so many women physicians problems. It causes us problems as parents. It causes us problems as children with aging parents. And it causes us problems with all of our decision making, perhaps changing a job, even travel decisions if you start to think outside of your practice. And so I actually run retreats, and one of my retreats, they collectively named themselves the Catastrophizers at the end, and they have a like group text thing. And I think it's just, once you start to see this, you can laugh at yourself. And I call it loving amusement. And so notice where you catastrophize and where you go the whole way down. Many women physicians worry that their children will end up drug addicts in jail. Like they just run, they have one incident with something and the whole thing goes the whole way down. And so if you can acknowledge this and see it, it's 80 to 90% better because you can laugh at yourself. We have an urgency bias. I call it the urgency tax, and it's in medicine sometimes important. If you're in the ER or the ICU, very important. Not important in your house, generally not important in the clinic. I was the chief of our pediatric clinic, and people come in with the biggest urgency about school forms and how if we're going to sign them on 364 days or 365 days, we have to decide this tomorrow. It's not urgent. And so realizing what's urgent in your life and the tax of inappropriately assigning urgency is very liberating. We also tend to think things are right and wrong, black and white. Uncertainty is generally bad. Risk is bad. These are all the things in medicine, and if you see how they play into interactions with your colleagues, interactions with your family, it's one of the reasons that as women physicians we're much more burnt out. And so I think once you see these, you can laugh at yourself, realize that they were trained into you, they're not your fault. And I love that piece because Otherwise, we go into the shame, blame, and guilt. This is my fault, and now I'm making it harder on myself, and why do I want to do that? Again, this is just part of our training. We also think more is better, hard is better. I had multiple leadership roles because more leadership roles is better, and the harder it is, it's better, and the harder training is more valuable, and if it's easy, it's not valuable. And that just sets you up for exhaustion and never arriving. Mistakes are dangerous is another one that really gets us into trouble. So we fear making mistakes, we fear making decisions, we ruminate, we get stuck on those things. So these are all the things that we've been practicing, okay? So what you practice grows, and if you can see them, you can begin to start to practice some other things. Imposter syndrome is the other one I just wanted to bring up for women physicians in particular. We're actually kind of trained to think about things from the imposter's standpoint, right? You were supposed to not know. It was like they're gonna ask you till you don't know, and they're gonna embarrass you in front of all the people, and other people are going to know, and who's gonna know what you don't know? And so it's almost incredulous to think that you wouldn't have it. It's not that there's anything wrong with you. So then you can just label it as that. You've been practicing that, and maybe it's not needed anymore, would be my approach to that. So those are the ones specific to women physicians. There's a couple more I didn't mention, which are the self-doubt, perfectionism, and people-pleasing. We tend to excel at all of those and practice all of those. And so what you practice grows. And so if you think about the fact, in my case, when I started understanding all of this, I was probably 50. And so I've been practicing this for at least 45 years, because if you go back to our families of origin, most of us who end up in medicine, we're kind of in charge in our families. Even when we were 5, we were practicing a lot of these over-responsibility and self-sacrifice, and I'm going to talk about those in my small groups tomorrow. And so realizing that these color our careers tremendously, and if you can start to see how it's impacting how you enjoy your practice and how you enjoy your patients and how you enjoy your families. I actually was working with a male OBGYN, and he was looking in his practice all day long for things that were wrong, and he was also running the practice. And he would arrive home and look for everything that was wrong and start telling his wife, who worked with him, and they had just this, and it was like, you haven't done this, and you haven't done this, and his children hadn't done this. And many of you probably do the same until you start to see this and you're like, wow, I realized that was just me coming home who'd been the pediatrician all day. That's what I did. And so I walked into the house and noticed what was wrong, what wasn't done yet. And so it really does color our careers, it colors our family lives. And once you see it, that's where you have the chance to change. And so I always like to say they helped us get where we are. And so if we are mean to ourselves about having them, or we think, we're less than because we've been doing all these things or making things harder on ourselves, it doesn't help. But they're not healthy or sustainable, and you can, as I say, opt out. You almost don't have to change them. You can just opt out or opt into loving amusement is one of my favorite things. And so I say they don't help us get there, meaning joy, wholeness, sustainability, whatever you would like your career to look like, maybe even just less miserable. And so those patterns cause stress, distress. They also cause feeling threatened. They cause reactivity. A lot of you will notice that you tend to be much more reactive than you might like to be. They basically cause sympathomagnetic storm, is what I like to say, right? So you're in fight or flight all the time. And most physicians are in fight or flight all the time. And so if you're thinking about this, those patterns release norepinephrine and cortisol, if you're thinking neurologically. And those tend to shut down your learning centers and your amygdala, and they switch you into survival, fight or flight. They make decision-making challenging. So we just go back to all these old habits, being reactive, and it's like a circle. And it's not healthy. And so just a reminder, it's not your fault, because many of us, we immediately go to that blame pattern that like, why am I like this? What's wrong with me? I'm broken. Nobody's broken. It's just the way that we were trained and the way what we've been practicing for all these years. So we can begin to practice new things. It's my thought. The first piece is the understanding. So understanding those patterns that you have and seeing them and seeing where they pop up in your life. So to me, that's the mindfulness piece. It's the slowing down enough to notice. And when we're mindful, we show up non-judgmentally. So we are not criticizing ourselves for doing it. So it's really the awareness and the noticing, and noticing where in your life and which relationships these things impact. I do a lot of parent coaching and relationship coaching for doctors because none of this is separate from our burnout. It infuses into all these little nooks and crannies. It infuses into how you relate to your mother and your daughter-in-law and all of these things. And so when you can begin to see this, you become a different person immediately, even before you make a change. The other piece is that you have to work on your nervous system, and we have to get out of fight or flight, sympathomagnetic storm. Otherwise, we're just practicing the same thing, willpower, pushing ourselves to change things, and it doesn't last is the real answer. Many of us can do that because we're experts at it, but it doesn't last long term. And so a lot of the work that I do in terms of yoga and mindfulness is to help people figure out how to upregulate your parasympathetic nervous system. That's the key. There's zillions of ways to do it. You don't have to sit on a mat and meditate. You don't have to tip upside down. But you do have to start to think about your parasympathetic nervous system and how can you upregulate it, because all of us are like this. And so if you bring it a little bit more to the middle, you will actually be able to shift out of these patterns. You'll be less reactive. That pause will be longer, and you can decide in the pause how you want to show up. And then when you have a healthier nervous system, you can begin to start to change your mindset. You can begin to start to use some of these tools and catchphrases and some of the more coachy tools to change your mindset and change your thought patterns. But really, the first two are the key. And then the other part can happen over years. And once you have the first two, you have plenty of time to change things. So mindfulness and nervous system rewiring are the key. So many people approach coaching and changing your mindset by literally changing the mindset. And they leave off the mindfulness piece and they leave off the nervous system piece. And to me, if you don't include those, you don't have long-term change. The other thing that you have to include, and most of us are really terrible at in medicine, is self-compassion. And I actually often don't even use the word self-compassion because it's so triggering for many of us. So kindness to self is the other way that you can call it. And if many people that I work with actually start way over here, which is just to stop being mean to yourself, to notice where you're mean, to notice the things that you do that are unkind, the things that you say that are unkind, where are you judging yourself, where are you comparing and despairing to other people, and just realize that that is mean. And if you can stop doing the mean part, that again pushes you way down along the course. So if you struggle with this concept of self-compassion, just really start to notice how you're mean and stop that. And if you actually look at medical culture, we were trained to be mean to ourselves. We were trained to say, you're not hungry, you're not tired. When I was growing up in medicine, I actually had a baby in med school and a baby in residency. And this was the late 90s, early 2000s. And if you wanted to see your child, that was not okay. Like you were not a good doctor, and you didn't care about your patients. And I actually had people tell me that when I was like, but I have to go pump because I'm breastfeeding. But that is the culture in medicine. And so realize that you were trained to be mean to yourself. And you were trained to think, well, wow, I really want to do this, but that means I'm not a good doctor. There's no winning there. And so just beginning to see this and beginning to see how it's colored your career, again, not from a mean standpoint, but just realizing that this training patterns stay long-term. We also impose them on other people because that's what we were taught. And so I do think it's important to start to realize when you see how they impact you, hopefully we can begin to change the culture. And if we are still criticizing ourselves and judging ourselves, we're not going to create a non-judgmental culture. And so this piece of self-compassion is absolutely essential. And so I encourage you here to practice self-compassion and mindfulness. And it's not the easiest thing. I think many of us are like, oh, you just sit on a mat and you're mindful, and many people beat themselves up over the compassion piece. So I wanted to give you a couple of tips. One, you can breathe. That's actually mindfulness. And for most of us, most physicians actually hold their breath. And in yoga, they teach you that most of us only breathe 30% of our lung volume, and physicians are about up here. And I noticed after I became a yoga teacher, I would come to conferences and the people standing next to you would be holding their breath. They're not even taking care of patients. And when you're in the exam room, you literally like talk like I'm doing here, and you hold your breath. And so breathing, we all know this, shifts your physiology. And so you can begin to shift your physiology by just breathing. And breathing actually activates the parasympathetic nervous system. So there are lots of places in your practice that you can bring in breathing. You can bring it in when you open the door. I used to breathe with my patients, and that can change it. And there's lots of very specific breathing techniques that you either learn in yoga or mindfulness. And for many people, having a specific technique helps them do it. So there's, for example, box breathing or 4-7-8 breaths, which are designed to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And 4-7-8 breaths, someone was talking about codes earlier today. I don't know if they're in the room, but a lot of ER docs will do 4-7-8 breaths when they get the trauma call before the patient comes in, so that they've activated their parasympathetic nervous system. So a lot of these tools, which help us outside of medicine and help us be happier humans, also help with patient care. And so what I encourage you to do is think about breathing and figure out what works for you. There are all those fancy breathing techniques, and for me, I literally used to just take deep breaths, breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. And if I get all complicated about counting, I get actually more stressed. And I just like to be transparent. 4-7-8 breath does not work for me. I'm much more stressed if I'm counting, and I don't like holding my breath that long. And so you really want to know yourself and know which kind of breathing relaxes you. And part of that is practice. And so I think it's something that you just have to try. There's always something in mindfulness that works for people. So many people say, I can't do mindfulness. And what I would say is there's a way to practice mindfulness for every human. And if you think about it as, I'm just upregulating my parasympathetic nervous system, you can start to be a little bit more accepting of how you do this. And so there's a lot of evidence around mindfulness and it helping you make better decisions in high stress situations. And so therefore, practicing medicine is also easier. And we always like to tie these things to patient care. But mindfulness is also known to be protective against PTSD and burnout. Tons and tons of evidence around that. One of the other practices that I like to share is this hand to heart. And I learned this from Shauna Shapiro, who's a PhD. She went to Duke and she does a lot of work at Stanford. And she espouses this hand to heart practice. We know that scientifically, hand to heart practice actually releases oxytocin. And so pressing the heel of your hand into the heart space releases oxytocin, which makes you feel good. So why wouldn't you do it? And then you can do a double hand to heart and you have the skin to skin. There are also studies more recently that show that this decreases the cortisol in your saliva. And so I literally do this now about 25 times a day. Feels amazing. I teach it in every yoga class at the beginning and end, because if you can begin to do this in the morning and at night, you all of a sudden remember that, oh, I have a heart, and maybe it's hurting, or maybe it needs this. You begin to get back in touch with who you are and what you need. And if you think back to our training, we were trained to not remember who we are. We all do things the same way. And we were trained to disregard our needs. And so you will begin, as you do this, to start to say, ooh, I have a heart, and ooh, it has some needs. And it's very subtle. So I will say, and I put in my bibliography, her book is called Good Morning, I Love You, and I really don't like the name. But if you, I have actually heard her speak and been to a workshop with her, and the gist of it is that she was going through a terrible time, and her therapist told her to do this hand to heart and say, good morning, I love you. And she didn't love herself, so she started with just good morning, and then ultimately she was able to say it, and now she actually has a children's book coming out about Good Morning Violet, I love you, and so that's why the book is called that. But it's an amazing book, and it actually talks a lot about the neuroscience, and I get no money from it if you buy it. I just love it. And so I think if you want to understand some of the neuroscience around the shame, blame, and guilt and the hand-to-heart practice, it's really helpful. But either way, I encourage you to just do it. And I will tell you that I don't say good morning, I love you. I literally just do hand-to-heart, say nothing, because that works for me. And so again, like if I start talking to myself, that feels a little bit strange. But connecting with the fact that you have a heart is really, really powerful. And I have many people who start doing this in yoga because it seems like okay to do in yoga, and then they can start doing it in their bed, or you can do it, before you go to bed or in the shower. And I literally visualize the cortisol decreasing, because cortisol, I know, does all these bad things. And so it's like you can trick yourself into beginning some of these practices that then change you. And if you think about what you practice grows. You practice hand to heart, you're practicing self-compassion, you're practicing checking in with yourself, you're practicing kindness, and you're growing that. And in that moment, you are not practicing shame, blame, guilt, catastrophizing, all of these other things. You're practicing presence. So the next tip would be noticing when you're unkind to yourself. And that, I think, is really the most important. And I see it as a continuum. So being unkind to yourself, and over here is self-love. Good morning, I love you, okay? In between, and there's kind of three pathways in my mind. You can be neutral about yourself. That works for a lot of people. You can be accepting of yourself. You can even be accepting and not liking, but accepting gets you closer to self-compassion. Or you can just be kind. Like for some of us, it's like, I'm just gonna be kind to myself. I'm not gonna be mean. And so realizing that for each of us, that pathway to self-compassion looks different. And you just have to figure out which one works for you. And reminding, and you mentioned this in your talk, that we're all different and we all have a different pathway. So it's not that any of these things are the be all and end all. It's sort of a smorgasbord of try what works for you. But you want to be very clear that what you're practicing is growing and what you're not practicing is receding. So remembering that when you practice judgment, you are bathing yourself with negative neurochemicals. When you're practicing shame, blame, and guilt, that's the norepinephrine and cortisol. When you are practicing kindness, you're bathing your nervous system in positive neurochemicals. So I call it, you want to create a delicious neurochemical soup. And you want, so you can start to think about, oh, well, which neurochemicals do I want to be releasing? And if you think about a lot of the studies around aging and telomeres and stress and all these things, like you really want to get those good neurochemicals out there. And so for a lot of us, that science of thinking about it that way, it's like, well, I need to be doing things that release healthy neurochemicals. And for me, that works really well. I'm like, ooh, this is bad. Like lots of cortisol, lots of norepinephrine. And it's not that you won't have any of that. You need some cortisol to get out of bed. But you want, that's why you want the soup. You want little bits of things and variety over time. So self-kindness releases the dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. So if you're thinking about that, many of us think self-kindness is a pass. It's complacency. I won't do anything better. But actually, it's releasing these healthy neurochemicals, which support things like motivation. They make us more productive, help us make better decisions. And so we know that science shows that these neurotransmitters encourage healthy motivation, decision making. They get you out of that rumination, not super helpful. Self-compassion, there's studies that show that it increases generosity as well. And so we might think, oh, this is selfish, I'm just taking care of myself. And the word self-care, I think, triggers a lot of people. And my mom actually, and I don't know, she's not listening, but she used to always talk about you being selfish. And it was like, if you ever did something for yourself, that was selfish. And I think it came from her mom. But for me, like when I hear self-care, that's very triggering for me. But self-advocacy or kindness is not, and so I can practice it that way. So again, you have to understand where you're coming from and what people said to you and what are your trigger things. And to me, if self-compassion actually increases generosity, then my mom's 100% wrong, and I can let go of the selfish. And it increases then service, right? And so all of us are here as physicians. So self-compassion is not giving yourself a pass. Even if you make a mistake or you have a perceived mistake, self-compassion releases that oxytocin, which actually triggers the learning centers. And so if you go into shame, blame, and guilt, you release norepinephrine, cortisol, you shut down your amygdala, and that does not honor the patient, and you don't learn. And so if you start to see how self-compassion actually impacts your brain, to me it made it much easier. And I was like, hand to heart all day long, I can do that. Some people actually have trouble with hand to heart. I really love it. But if you have trouble with it, you can do your hand to belly. This doesn't work for me. I've had 3 kids, so I'm always like, yeah, there's a belly there. So I like this. But for some of you, that may feel better, or it may seem a little more appropriate, depending on what medical setting you work in. Other studies show it's not a pass because self-compassion increases your exercise, it improves your health. And all of this, there's science around it. Increases productivity. So for those of you who think it's a pass and it's complacent and you're, we were actually kind of trained, if you're nice to yourself, you won't be as good a doctor. But actually, if you're nice to yourself, you'll be a better doctor. And you'll be modeling for patients also how to be kind to themselves. And so if you want to change, you want to stop practicing some things and start practicing other things, you have to be kind to yourself. So that's the other piece in there. There's the mindfulness, the understanding, the noticing. There's the parasympathetic, you've got to have a healthy nervous system. You also can't be completely depleted if you want to change. Like, we can't change from a totally depleted state. So you have to figure out how can you replete yourself and what repletes you. And then you have to bring in self-compassion. Otherwise, none of the shifts that you make stick. We're all good at doing things short term, but they don't last and integrate, and you don't become this person who practices different things. We just go back to our old patterns. The other thing I'll say is that a lot of those negative patterns that we've been practicing, I believe that medical school and residency is a little bit of a trauma situation. And so when you are exposed to thought patterns and ways of thinking in a trauma situation, they stick. They're much stickier. And so just acknowledging that these are very sticky because of where we learned them. And it's a little bit harder for us to let them go. And so maybe we can let them go a little by little by little, and you can practice being a little more kind to yourself, for example. So my invitation would be to grow mindfulness, grow self-compassion, and grow practices and thought patterns that optimize your sustainability.